Hello, welcome to another episode of Out of the Fire podcast. We talk about fire and we talk about interoperability, data, and all the hot things that are happening in healthcare IT and healthcare tech at the moment. And this week, I am excited to have Scott on the podcast. Scott, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Scott Rossignol. I'm a consultant in the interoperability space in healthcare. I've worked in interoperability and with EHRs for about 15 years. I started my career at Epic. Spent about 7 years there. And ever since then, I've been working more in the software development space, helping organizations get connected to EHRs and using interoperability standards to do that work.
Awesome. Scott, how did you get into FHIR? I have my own kind of story about that, but just curious, have you kind of been there since the beginning, or have you really just gotten into this kind of happenstance?
Yeah, I got into FHIR in typical fashion for me, which is head first, sort of. I actually sold an application that would use FHIR to pull data and transform that data into a registry data model. This was back when I was working at Nordic, and we sold this application to a registry organization out there and helped them then deploy it. So I actually wrote the entire thing and deployed it with different health systems using Epic. That was my first introduction to FHIR and the intricacies of using FHIR in the production space. So we were parsing medications, procedures, demographic details, all sorts of information to support a heart failure registry, and we were able to get a lot of great outcomes from that work. But the most interesting thing was that the product itself is great. It's still running. It's still out there. It's called Registry Direct. But what I learned using FHIR at that point, and all of the information I learned about implementing FHIR with Epic organizations, was really very valuable to a lot of different software vendors. And so as I started talking with organizations as part of my consulting role at Nordic, I started learning that there's a lot of organizations out there that need help, that need somebody who's got experience doing this work. And so I was able to build up a lot of more experience working with new organizations to do the same thing.
That's awesome. I think that one thing that is cool that you actually have experience with building actual applications with FHIR, where I think a lot of times when we hear about folks working with FHIR or just getting into FHIR, there's not a lot out there in terms of actual implementations that are using FHIR and have been for years. So this is kind of cool to, hear that. I too kind of got into the whole space of being kind of like in health data, and for quite a long time, 15 plus years of different roles. And even when I was at large health systems and a large health payer, FHIR was kind of just in the background. There was kind of like point solutions and people working on future projects, but not really like front and center. And really, the last 3 years, I got my hands on. Trying to map data to FHIR, trying to understand FHIR. What do you think is the biggest barrier to entry with FHIR? What do you think that there's obviously like software developers that are used to, and the technologies are very similar and familiar, but like even for people who are not software engineers, like why is it there's such a barrier kind of to entry with FHIR?
Yeah, I don't know that the barrier is really with FHIR specifically. I think the harder thing about integrations in healthcare is that the healthcare is complex. The FHIR is a great way to standardize data retrieval in a RESTful model, right? It allows you to understand how you're going to receive data and how you're going to obtain it. It does a lot of things better than some of the other specifications out there, but it doesn't do everything that you need in healthcare. And I think one of the biggest barriers is really understanding that to define a great solution, a great product, you really need to understand the different methods that the EHR support and how those different methods work together. Right? So if you need event-based pushes in your application, maybe you want to know when a patient's visit is scheduled or when they arrive to the hospital, FHIR's not going to do that for you, right? And you need to then look to other standards like the HL7 ADT or SIU feed for something like that. And as you get deeper into those details, then it becomes a question of how many different implementations of technology do I have to set up with my customer organization. in order to get my application live. And what does that mean to me? If I don't know how to implement an HL7 version 2 interface, I just know what the specification looks like. I'm going to get some pipe delimited data. That's a really great start from a technical perspective, but the healthcare organization, the customer that I'm working with, doesn't want to teach me everything about implementing that HL7 v2 interface. And so this is really where the complexity of healthcare comes into play, is that there's a lot of different standards in the mix, and there probably will be for a very long time. And all of those standards need to be well understood. And you need to understand your customer's perspective on those standards, how they should be used and how they should be deployed as well.
Absolutely. So I think that people underestimate the level of work sometimes that goes into these solutions, especially if the use case is very complex and everything is based on your particular use case, right? And how you look at things and what you see as the end goal of what you're trying to accomplish. So I think it's a very good point to say that FHIR is just one of many different standards out there. How do you explain to folks, like, one of the biggest things that I've always struggled with is people just use the base FHIR spec to start working on their development and start doing work, and before they actually jump in and look at implementation guides or look at specific profiles for specific use cases. And I think that's a big miss, because a lot of times people end up duplicating or redoing work years later because they kind of created their own custom thing. Oh, we used FHIR, but we used, or we just went at the spec. What do you mean? Oh, there's a whole working group working on this, and there's already implementation guides. Take a lot of these examples with, there's obviously prior auth, there's quality measurement, there's all these other things. What do you think is the trade-off immediately and then long-term, in terms of you may put in a little bit more upfront to look into an implementation guide and actually see if it meets your use case versus just jumping right into developing your own kind of base FHIR implementation?
So a lot of the world I live in revolves around the electronic health record or the payer systems that you're integrating with. So what it comes down to a lot of the time here is that you need to understand what software you're integrating with and what that supports. The documentation for that software or conversations with the software team is going to really help you understand maybe a little bit more about what they can do for you. Looking at FHIR.epic.com, for example, is going to help you understand what capabilities you have access to. That really differs from the world of the standards that you're referencing there. And I think that that's really important, because if you go do your homework and you say, oh, wow, like this Argonaut project is providing all this capability for scheduling, I want to use that. Let me go build an application around this. And then you get to, the EHR, and none of them actually support the full cohort of capabilities there, or that IG in general. Now you're between a rock and a hard place, right? You have your actual customers and the software they're using doesn't support what you want to do, and you have to basically start from scratch, because everything you've done, while it might be supported in the future, needs to be ported back into what that EHR actually supports and can enable. So I think the standards are amazing when they're fully deployed and they have good adoption. Understanding what that looks like in the real world and for your customer base, is going to be really important to creating a product that you don't have to then rebuild a couple times or a year later. So it's sort of like, what I like to do is I like to say, start with the EHR, understand the EHR and what it provides, or the system of record. In general, it's not always an EHR, but once you understand that, then go learn about the standards as well, because maybe the standards will allow you to have your internal data model at your side of the application that really complies with those standards, and then have that ported over to the EHR. And that way you still have something that can grow with you. So it's really, I definitely agree. I love the idea of educating yourself on standards. I actually made this mistake a couple of weeks ago. I didn't realize there was a DaVinci notification IG, and I was working on a notifications project, and it was pretty funny because somebody pointed it out to me, and I know a lot about DaVinci and actually help educate other folks about DaVinci implementation guides, but I didn't know about this one. So there's always more room to learn, and there's always time to grow, and it's important that when you do find that out and you realize, oh, there's this thing out there that actually can help me, go learn about it, figure it out, and what can it offer you, and bring that knowledge back. It's never too late.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think there's a better way to just be able to find those implementation guides out there. And I know HL7 has like a search engine and other stuff, but honestly, a lot of times when I've been doing research about certain use cases and implementations, like I'll find the implementation guide, but it's there hasn't been any activity on it since like 2018,
Hmm.
and it was like STU version one or something. So I'm like hesitant. I'm hesitant to look at that because I'm like, well, it's 2025. That's about what, 7 years old now. And even if that, whatever that implementation guide, did to kind of standardize things, that unless that was adopted by the industry, to your point, and also it's probably out of date at this point, right? So like, do we need some sort of like a flag that HL7 just like puts on these implementation guides, maybe like this is kind of out of date now. Like don't look at that, because I see a lot out there. And that's also like another question I was going to ask you is, I had a conversation with Mark Kramer from MITRE, and one of the things he said is like the unintended consequences of the proliferation of like these implementation guides in FHIR is one of the issues, is one of the problems we need to solve, potentially where AI comes in. But like, what do you think about that as well? Because that could also be a bad thing that could slow you down potentially, and then even have you throw resources at something that's not really a workable solution. So you got to be very careful, basically, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like there are different groups that are measuring maturity of standards and, the life cycle of standards in different ways. And they actually kind of conflict with each other from time to time. If you look at the HL7 Da Vinci Project standards and the maturity kind of page that they have, it shows a lot of standards as totally mature for that release, right? In the green with the arrow all the way to the right. But that doesn't mean that it's ever been adopted and used in production, right? So like the idea of maturity is actually a number of different things. Is the standard complete in the sense that the community has no more feedback? Yes. Is the standard complete in the sense that everyone's adopted it and it's 100% in use today? Is a different question. And we need to be able to measure both of those. The ONC has this concept of the SVAP, right? And the SVAP allows for the maturity of standards, or like the ongoing improvement of standards over time, rather than having a standard sort of be set in stone and always be used. So there's different concepts out there like that allow us to sort of say like, okay, we understand this to be here, but we needed to get it to this other place. And how do we move from this direction onwards? And how do we communicate that in a cohesive way? It's a really good question. One of the things that you brought up is like, how do you find these standards? And so I just searched HL7 R4 condition in Google. And the first thing that comes up is the HL7 build website, which is the R6, the release 6 version of the condition FHIR resource. And you know how confusing that could be, right? Like, so I can't actually find the R4 spec right from the first page of Google.
Unless you know how to navigate,
Yeah.
right?
And so like from somebody who doesn't really understand the difference between R6 and R4 and how massive that can be for your implementation, like they're probably going to go off that V6 version and use that detail and build a great app in R6, but it's not going to be portable to the current implementation in most DHRs. And so there's a lot I think we can do better in terms of communication. I don't know what that means. I don't have solutions, but we certainly need to be able to kind of communicate across a couple of different wavelengths as far as like what a standard is, what it does, how mature is it from the standards perspective, and how mature is it from the implementation perspective.
Yeah, and that's a very common also situation that I've seen, is that, the R5 profile, and people jump into that because that I think Google just indexes on what is the most recent version of whatever, and so that's not always what is actually used. And so I remember we had just so many issues with that, where we were evaluating a particular resource or profile, and we're looking at the R4, and then somebody just puts in a link, and it's in the R5, and they've been working on it for like a month, and it's the R5 version, and it's actually a nicer, better version of the profile for that particular resource than the R4, right? Like, one that comes to mind is like Measure Report. Measure Report is like way nicer in R5 than the R4, right? And there's a whole bunch of those, like trying to remember some other examples. But how do you solve that better? Like, what advice can we give HL7 to I guess part of it is education, like better education, but also like when somebody clicks on that link on Google, have like a little pop up and say, consider that 99% of the industry is still using R4. So when you're doing an implementation, even though we HL7 say, R5 is the normative version right now, that doesn't really mean much because nobody's using it. So, or is that just
Exactly.
education? Just anybody who gets into FHIR, just tell them, hey, don't use R5, just go use R4. And then once R6 is around, let's see what happens. But like, how do you manage that?
It's a great question. I think a lot is being done in that space to get information out there. And so it is accessible, but it requires you to dig those multiple layers in. And I think, part of it is the responsibility of the developer to do their research and make sure that they really understand the playing field. You can't scope a product out and just like by looking at a single web page and saying, okay, I'm just going to go do this. That's why I always go back to the EHR or the source of truth, the system of record that you're integrating with. Like that's the documentation of that system of record is not going to be as confusing. It's not going to say use our here's our, if they don't support our. So I think that's where I always want to start. And then I want to use the HLC implementation guides as a reference and really kind of build my knowledge from those, but start with the system of records documentation. Because implementations of FHIR aren't necessarily standardized either. Like you might think that you can use the same kind of OAuth with every EHR, but you can't, right? You need to really like think about how you're going to implement your product with your first customer and not how you want to like implement your product against the standard. And really understanding the standards after the fact is then going to help you build that more portable product.
Yeah. So let's get into some of this. You have, I think, a tremendous amount of experience connecting to the HRs, trying to get data. How's that been?
I mean, there's a lot of different examples of good and bad. I implemented a Smart on FHIR application one time in 3 days with a health system. We had it up and running in production. And so that's feasible, right? If the right parties are motivated and engaged in the conversation, it can happen without much effort at all. Then there's another instance where we had a FHIR application ready to go. We were engaged with a customer. We had a contract signed. That customer didn't know that they had to submit the application through a second security work group. And that security work group required a 6-month lead time. So, you can do all your homework and everybody can feel really comfortable and ready to go. We had tested the application in non-production, but we could not go into production until we got through that other process. And so, in healthcare, like you got to be ready for a lot of delays. You got to have a lot of options out there, right? Like you should be working with multiple different pilot customers and thinking about timelines as something that can take very long in order to make sure that your product really does get that user feedback and user acceptance testing that it requires. I think the other side of this is really about the technology. Like we're talking about FHIR, right? Or Smart on FHIR here, understanding how the system of record, just to go back to that again, implements those and how you actually configure those things inside of that system. It's going to be really important so that you have a smooth experience with the customer organization. Again, because those folks don't want to educate you about how to build the system. They want you to tell them how they should set things up, how the product should behave with their users in the system and all of that. And that's what a really great vendor can provide is this full knowledge of the system of record back to that healthcare system or payer that is actually using the product, because that way they know that you really know your stuff and that you're going to be a great partner for them. So yeah, I think there's more to it than this too. Like if you're combining technologies, then you really need to think about like how long is HL7 v2 going to take? Am I going to use a VPN versus HTTPS? Do I need mutual TLS involved in that? Like there's so many different questions that come up as more technologies get involved. So you really need to think about like each one of those verticals of integration. How do I build it so that it works with the EHR? How do I implement it so that the customer doesn't have to take on all of that burden? And then pull it all together into a single plan.
Can you talk about and maybe give people a little bit of an explanation of what Smart on FHIR is? I know a lot of people probably know, but there's probably a good amount of people that are not really in the weeds. Can you just explain why that's like a quicker and maybe that example of where you were able to get that app live in 3 days? Like what went right in that situation to enable that to happen?
So a Smart on FHIR application essentially allows you to embed your web page into the electronic health record. And that web page also, it receives context from the EHR. So when you have a user involved in the workflow, and they're inside of a patient's chart, for example, now your application knows who that user is, what patient chart am I in, what encounter am I inside, and it receives all of that through like a FHIR payload, an OAuth plus FHIR payload, essentially. So Smart on FHIR is a great way to marry sort of a UI-based integration and FHIR, allowing you access to obtain more FHIR data because you get an access token through that OAuth handshake as well. Really great for usability and really great to put, your product inside of the EHR in front of users. So the way that went right, the way we were able to get that up and running in 3 days is that we had the right people engaged on the health system side, and they had experience implementing this. We also had experience, of course, implementing these functionalities, and we're able to sort of just get together, in a 30-minute meeting, say, this is what I need. I need X, Y, and Z created in the system. I need a user record. I need a menu record that creates this button in the chart. And I need to be able to then view my application as a sidebar inside of the chart so that users can pull it up. I need these types of users to have access to that sidebar. Sort of all those implementation details, right? Like it was an application for nurses. And so we didn't need care managers or social workers or providers to see that. And we were able to provide all of those details because we sort of knew all the parameters already around how that app needed to be deployed. So provide that up front, give that all to the right folks at the health system, allow them to do their jobs because they know what they're doing. Testing's the other aspect of that. The more functionalities that you deploy, the harder it's going to be to test. And really what you want to see is you want to see something that's like deployed. Well, if your product is already working, right, and it's a web page, you just deploy it and it'll still work inside of that iframe. But you really want to keep kind of what you're showing inside of that EHR to a minimum so you can have your testable functionalities and kind of make it simple if you're looking for a fast deployment.
How do you negotiate the whole process? And I know Epic is its own, it could go very, very well in certain situations. It could take forever in other situations. And just the way that everything is set up where you're working with, different health systems that have different versions of Epic potentially. There's capability differences. There's all kinds of things to negotiate. And I think Epic's support, is getting better, but I don't think it's ideal from just knowing that if you have an app deployed, you then to take advantage of a new version of APIs or whatnot, you have to then redeploy that app and have to get it. And it's it could potentially take 6 months for if you're, to go through some of those approvals. And it's what is your been experience with Epic in general?
Yeah.
On that side?
I mean, the Epic team the vendor services team is small. They don't have thousands of people there to serve the thousands of vendors that they have. And so you're really competing for time, knowing what to ask for and asking for everything and really being very thoughtful about how you go about that is really important so that you have a single turnaround, right? You don't want to have a 10 question loop where you're going back and forth and you have to wait 3 days to get an answer each time. You want to be able to get all that information in front of them, get the response that you need and move forward. That's really hard to do. It's not necessarily something I've been successful at all the time. I've gotten into conversations where it's hard to explain what I'm asking for even or what advice I'm looking for. I ask for calls if I can to just hash things out. 30 minutes on a call is going to be a lot faster than going back and forth over email or, Epic has this Sherlock ticketing concept too. Overall, every EHR presents different benefits and different drawbacks. I love that Athena and eClinicalWorks provide this button click based deployment, right? It makes implementation a complete breeze. I love that Epic has great user experience compared to the other EHRs. I can present my application in 15 different ways inside of Epic, and I can really design it for the workflow and the user type. And I don't have that flexibility in other EHRs. Cerner provides great FHIR APIs, and they have a lot of different write-back capabilities, even for scheduling. That makes a lot of what Cerner, a lot of what we're doing in integration easier. But the fact that I haven't repeated any one of those benefits across the same EHRs, it just means that as a vendor, you're kind of bending and, dodging and weaving with each EHR to get the best experience. And you really do have to approach it that way. Your data model might be the same. you should have the same workflows and sort of the same, collecting the same data from each AHR, but like how that actually presents and how you integrate is going to be completely different. That interface with the AHR and how you're collecting data and presenting to the user is going to change based on what they provide.
Yeah, and we've seen like even vendors supporting different versions of FHIR, and I would just like I'll put this out there and tell people right now, like, do not waste your time for anything other than R4, right? Like
Yeah.
they have DSTU2, I think DSTU3 still. They're live. Those APIs are live. You can hit them. Do not waste your time because everything is available in R4 and you can pull it from those systems. In the situation that you have a client that only has that version, their EMR is really supposed to be upgraded to the point where they can support R4, right? Like I think I've worked with Allscripts, where it was such an old version where they did not do the upgrade yet. So they only had DSTO2 available, and I think 4 was very limited. But even in that case, like they were doing the upgrade eventually, or just like many organizations, they're just like going to Epic. Like don't like make sure you're also understanding how you're actually that you're not doing throwaway work, right?
Yeah. It really is very expensive. And, I think it's really hard to predict how expensive customization is going to be for you. It's not ever going to present at face value. Looking at specs and saying, oh, let's just port the application to DSTU2 and we'll be able to accommodate this one customer. It's extra work, but we'll get it done. You're going to end up, you should quadruple whatever your estimates are from the outset and like realize that one customer is going to take up your development team's time, so they're not focused on other things as well. That opportunity cost can really be a big burden when it comes to customization. And a lot of the organizations that I work with that are successful are pushing on use of standards and they're saying no to customers when those organizations aren't ready for the integrations that they require.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if they're not ready, you shouldn't be the one that is introducing more tech debt and more legacy debt on top of their system just so that you can make some quick bucks, right? Like you should be saying, hey, with all due respect, and we want the best for your organization. We want to work with the modern tech stack and standards. We don't want to enable you to maybe hit some quick wins, but then have a much bigger problem down the line. And I think that's like good partners and organizations that are good partners will always, come up and say, that's why you're hiring experts, right? That like know this stuff. All right, TEFCA. So this is the other hot topic I think we had on the agenda. What do you want to say about TEFCA and TEFCA and all the other, I think, Scott, out of all people, you've actually been pretty like visible on LinkedIn, trying to provide some feedback to some folks out there when trying to make these connections and trying to enable this vision of true, interoperability and a true national network. Like, let's get into it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, nationwide interoperability is just like critically important. We all know that, right? There are certain truths about this conversation that everyone knows, and then the rest becomes this like political game of chance, or I don't even know how to describe it. The TEFCA itself provides a lot of governance, right? And governance is what creates what I call a required use case. And if you want nationwide interoperability on a given topic, like I want to be able to get HEDIS data for quality measures, right? Or I want to be able to get data for treatment. Those are required use cases. We have to be able to obtain data from another party that we should have HIPAA access to through trust and not through contracting. I don't know what percentage of integration costs for different vendors and payer and provider organizations is, but it's got to be like 60% of the time you spend is really about like talking with the organization, contracting, and then implementing. If we can get rid of all of those conversations and the implementation work, because it's just on by default and available, we're saving a huge amount of resources and time. And that's what TEFCA aims to do. TEFCA is built on the national networks that exist today, and they are working extremely well for treatment. Treatment is the HIPAA required use case that allows providers to get data from other providers. Treatment is very explicit in HIPAA, where it says providers must be able to obtain data about a patient that they have a treatment relationship with. And HIPAA is like, very clear that this is a requirement and you can't stand in the way. HIPAA is the opposite of that when it comes to any other data exchange. So healthcare operations and payment use cases are really much murkier. And I work a lot in the Da Vinci space. I work with payer-provider interoperability. And I'll tell you, like, without clarity from HIPAA, from HHS, we're probably never going to see a required use case because there's simply too many different ways that you can frame the argument against this trust-based exchange. Should continue pushing forward. I like what they're doing mostly. I think that we have the right approaches across a lot of the different problems that TEFCA is solving. Like trying to use FHIR and CDA documents is the right approach because FHIR and CDA provide different value for different use cases. The way that they authenticate and the way that they look at data exchange for these use cases is great. Now it just comes down to the politics. How can we all get together and say, like, look, we just need to make this happen. How do we do it? We already have the technical stuff figured out. We don't need to care about that anymore. How do we politically all get the motivation to make this happen is the biggest question. And that's where TEFCA is stalling, because you can try to force things, but if people aren't coming to the table, then you're not going to have their participation. And without participants on a network, you don't have a network.
Kind of like if you think about when you were in school or in your grade school or high school and you guys are all sitting around in the lunchroom and people like kind of like they just bunch up in their own little cliques. Mm-hmm. And then there's like you sitting with your friends and then there's another group sitting with their friends and they just don't talk to each other. And they're like, hey guys, wait a second, get up here. And then like maybe years later, you meet that person at this high school reunion or whatever. And you're like, oh, wait, we have so much in common. And we're like, we could have been like friends all along. And it kind of seems like that, right? Like, especially the whole payer provider thing, like it's always like us versus them. And I think to really make this TEFCA work, like the true benefits come when you have everybody on the network. And right now, I think what we have maybe a third of providers and maybe zero payers. I don't know. Has there been any payers that
I'm not aware of any right now?
Not that I've heard of, right? So it's just like this seems like a huge lost opportunity. And if there is like things broken in terms of like just regulatory and politics, as you mentioned, table, right? I know we have the prior auth deadline coming up with CMS 0057, 1/1/2027, right?
That's correct.
Can that succeed without these conversations happening and maybe even people collaborating on TEFCA and actually sharing data?
Yeah. The prior auth requirements can succeed without TEFCA. What it comes down to is that every provider already has a contract with every payer that they're doing business with. And so those providers know which payers they need to integrate with. It might be 80 payers, right? It could be 10. I'm not sure. But they can go set up one-off connectivity with each individual payer. Or there are some organizations out there that are kind of sitting in the middle and saying, hey, we'll actually set up that connectivity and you just send us your CRD request and we'll get it out to the right organization. So there are technical solutions that should make this happen. I think the CMS aligned network concept kind of leaves space for that to happen in something of a sanctioned manner, instead of a company just coming out and saying, hey, we're providing this prior auth service. They can say, hey, we're doing this in a way that aligns with what CMS requires. And so you as a customer of that can feel a little bit more confident that it's going to be portable and useful in the future and not just another one-off investment that you've made for another CMS regulation. I think like what we're not looking at from the payer provider's perspective, though, is the holistic exchange that really is going to govern the actual value for payers and for providers in this space. We are very focused on implementing individual data exchange patterns for specific reasons. And I really agree that prior auth needs that and should be the focus right now. But payers don't think about prior auth data as any different than care management data or risk adjustment data or quality measurement data and all those other things that they're doing with data. So when we think about data exchange between payers and providers, we really should just be thinking about what does a payer need about this patient? Let's figure out how to get that payer everything they need so that we can then make all of those downstream processes easier. Why do we need to implement interoperability 4 times, right, between the same 2 parties? We shouldn't have to do that. And that's really where I wish we had started from the interoperability space, is not to say you have to do prior auth. It's to say you both need to be able to send and receive the entire patient's medical record in a manner that is compliant with HIPAA. If we had started there, providers get reciprocity. They're getting the data that they need from payers, which they sorely need and they spend a lot of time asking for. And payers get the data that they're spending a lot of time and money asking for. And we kind of just get rid of all of this other stuff. All right, now let's build on top of that. Let's put prior auth in place. Right. So the approach that we're taking, I feel like should have started more holistically and then moved into the point solution space where we're doing prior authorization on top of the data exchange. Unfortunately, that's not where we are. I've been pushing TEFCA healthcare operations as the best way to actually do that. You can use healthcare operations to get a CDA document from a provider if this actually goes live. And that would just be amazing. Payers can go get data for their attributed members and then use it. And I think that's what we're all looking to do. So, it's kind of crazy to me that we're not focused entirely on that February date of 2026 for TEFCA healthcare operations. I wish that we were all trying to make that a reality and really focused on that, because doing so would bring value to payers to be on TEFCA. It would drive them into the process and allow us to expand, like I was talking about, holistic down to point.
So record locator service in TEFCA works great, right? Like you can go in now. Epic just announced that they're finally going to have this master ID concept, which is like, why did that take 20 years? I don't know. But like, I know that there's been all kinds of considerations probably from not wanting to have that, so that, people would have to go through different channels. But now that that's there, and I've definitely heard some concerns about that as well, that it's going to be used as a different kind of like framework for the patient as well. So like with CMS aligned networks, we now have another, is it like a third way to connect? So it's like, I'm hoping that through CMS aligned networks, it kind of makes data accessible that some organizations have already gotten, right? And they spent time connecting, be it, I think there's like 60 companies that pledged, and I think there's probably more than 60 now. Like, is that going to be the answer? And then how do you make that work? Like 60 data companies now are going to share data. So does that mean I can now go to any one of those companies and say, okay, I'm looking for this patient, or I'm looking for this organization's data. I'm trying to enable this use case. Let's say prior auth. Can we contract so that you guys give me the, quick access endpoint to pull that information without doing the custom integration with that provider, right? And then what does that do then to, let's say TEFCA has the same thing, but it's just a separate thing. Is there a healthy competition there, maybe to get things going faster with TEFCA?
Yeah, the way I would like to see CMS aligned networks come into the world, and really they're not right now. It was just a few press releases at this point, right? There's work being done. I know that, but it's not visible, right? Once we see what happens, we'll know more. But at this point, the way I would like to see CMS aligned networks come to fruition is to be a testing ground for the use cases that are really important to everybody, to show real production exchange via certain, SOPs or processes that the CMS helps create, or those networks help create. Bring those mature cases into TEFCA and say, okay, now these are required in TEFCA. TEFCA should be the ultimate standard of nationwide interoperability, but it should not be defining use cases and then requiring those use cases without maturity in the production space. It needs to adopt mature use cases. It's done that successfully with treatment. I think IAS has problems, right? And I think healthcare operations has problems. And what we're going to see is that these things get created, they get changed, they get removed and then re-added. And I don't like that for TEFCA. What I want to see TEFCA do is just to take a mature standard and make it a required standard on TEFCA, and kind of take out some of the back and forth and the arguing over what should and should not be, by allowing CMS aligned networks to establish a use case on their own, prove that it works, and then bring it forward. Once we see a use case working, you could have issues with it. We all have issues with CDA documents, but you know what? Like, it works. Go use it. That's much better than something that doesn't exist at all. And what we need is stuff that exists. We need data exchange.
And perfect doesn't exist, right? Like there's no such thing as perfect interoperability. Perfect is the enemy of good. And like really what we need to do is enable the good enough so that folks can get, I don't care about really the records I have at a health system like 15 years ago. Honestly, I don't care about that. If I'm a caretaker or there are things that a provider may need, But me as a patient, I care less. I just need you to be able to get the records from my last 5 years and have all the medications there, all my lab results, all the things, so that you have at least a full picture of like, hey, this is Gene. He's got high blood pressure, hypertension, or whatever, and here's what he's been doing about it. And so I think that's a really good conversation to have. And I think more players in the system should help that, right? Because we know there is data exchange happening. There are significant investments companies have made all over the place, from all of these different data aggregators, startups, HIEs, even the QHINs. Like, everybody has done so much work. It's just like, let's enable that, like information superhighway, talk about
Yeah.
the old internet term, but like, that's what it is. It's like a superhighway for this data exchange, so that it flows regardless of, like, to your point, the standard is a CCDA or FHIR. Like, even getting a CCDA is good enough, because a lot of times you can parse CCDA into FHIR if you wanted to. So there's all kinds of things you can do, and we just need the conversations to happen and the communication to happen. I think, like, the new organizations that are trying to get involved in interoperability, and there's like thousands and thousands of companies out there, I think, right now, that are looking, that have been in the space. They want to get data, or they want to exchange their data with their customers. What would you say to them? How do you go about, like, selecting a QHIN, like selecting do you go patient access versus just having a BAA agreement with a provider network, right? It's a pretty complex topic, but if there's anybody that could give advice on that, I think it's...
Sure. I mean, the first place I would start is actually don't. Don't interoperate. Build your product. Make your product something that users want to use. Like, that make sure that the thing that you're doing is really actually worth the time. In healthcare, I think people have tried to solve the same problems 5, 10, 1,000 times over and over. What you might see as a problem, or a space that's eager for disruption, might actually be not a technical issue at all, but more of an operational problem that a technical solution needs to, maybe can't solve, or needs to be perfectly catered towards the operational issues in order to solve. So that's where I'd first start, is that don't build a product that first initially requires integration. Build a product that works and pleases your customers and improves with integration. When you're ready to integrate, Gene, you already said it, like, figure out what data superhighway is best one for you. IAS is a great option if you have patients that are driving your application, because that is easy to implement. That's easy to get up and running, and it's basically free to do with any EHR. Supposedly easy with payers. My experience with that has been pretty poor, but it's improving with IAS. The other routes to get data are basically BAA. Like, you have to have one-off contracts with each organization that you're getting data from, unless you can fit into the very narrow TEFCA SOPs or similar. So you really need to look at these things in detail. You need expertise, or you need to go read and chat GPT your way through these things to really understand what the different superhighway options are out there, which ones you might be able to leverage, and how that impacts your application from implementation, data access perspectives. And I'm sure there's other perspectives too, like a Smart on FHIR application is going to be harder to implement if you're putting it in front of a user, right? Because you have to change the EHR. So there's a whole lot to think about there. And where I would start is just like defining your superhighway, figuring out which option makes sense, and then like really digging in from there to understand, who can provide you access, what's the best, cheapest, or, most effective route to take, and all of those different questions that kind of differ depending on your application.
Right. Yeah. You kind of have to do your research, right? And I really understand your use case and how the data is going to help you get to where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
And what exactly do you need, right? Just like jumping in the water is great, but like, you need to figure out which direction you're going to swim to, and what exactly, because it is a lot of work. Potentially, even any one of these use cases can take an organization, months and years even, right?
Yeah. Oh, even an IS application could take 2 developers 8 months to get access to all the data that you were looking to do, and really provide your users the actual access they need. It's not trivial, and that's the easiest pathway.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to track and see all of the exciting developments around interoperability and FHIR. Scott, if you're, I know you have like stuff that you share pretty regularly, so you can follow Scott on LinkedIn. But like DaVinci, you mentioned DaVinci, so people can go look at the DaVinci working group. And is there any particular highlights you want to announce over the next couple of months that people would want to look at?
Yeah, if you're implementing any DaVinci standards, check out DaVinci Trebuchet. That's the project that I help to run along with a few other folks. We volunteer our time to help organizations pilot the DaVinci standards because we want to see production traffic. It's completely free to join. You're just, we're there to do good and try and advance interoperability. And we welcome anyone. So please check it out if you're interested in any of the DaVinci standards. Join our meetings. They're every other Thursday, and you can find those on the DaVinci Confluence if you search Google or, whatever search engine.
Okay, well, Scott, thank you for your time. And hopefully we could get to talk again at some point, maybe revisit some of the things in, 6 months next year or something like that and see how things have played out.
That sounds great. Thanks, Gene.
All right. Thank you.